welcome everyone listening, whether you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen to your podcasts. You are currently listening to the Theology Mill from Wipf and Stock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I work here at Wipf and Stock, and I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, come stop by our website at wipfandstock.com. That's WIPF and stock, STOCK.com. And on this episode, which is a standalone episode, I get to interview Dr. Stephen DeLay. Stephen earned his PhD in philosophy at Oxford in 2017 and is the author of several books of philosophy and fiction, including a handful now with us at Wipf and Stock. He's also an old member of Christ Church, Oxford, and a fellow of Ambrose College, Woolf University. So without further ado, friends, let's head over to the interview. So I am here with Stephen DeLay, who is a research fellow at the Global Center for Advanced Studies, and also a tutorial fellow at Woolf University. Is that right?
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay, good. And he has written a kind of an insane amount of books you finished your PhD in what, like 2019, 2018?
2017.
2017. Okay, I'm a year off. But yeah, I'm super impressed by the amount of like volumes you've published and that you have in process, and we'll get into those. I mean, you've got like phenomenology stuff, philosophy of religion stuff, but also fiction as well, which will be fun to chat about a bit. But before we get to that, let's, as we always do, let's talk about what we are sipping on. So I have a decaf coffee because it's afternoon here on the Pacific Coast. Which I know decaf is like not, I think from what my understanding, I'm not like a coffee buff or anything, but from my understanding, decaf generally is not quite as high quality. But I have a really nice decaf blend from Latin America, by Temple Coffee Roasters that's down in Sacramento, because I got to be faithful to my upper left coffee roasters. But it's really nice. I'm enjoying it, and I'm just drinking it black as I always do. So that's what I am sipping on. What about you, Stephen?
I'm having a black coffee also. I've always drank black coffee. I had a friend in college that used to chastise me for that. And he always say, "Well, if you're going to drink black coffee, why don't you just get an Americano?" And
I see.
I never had a rational response, because when I thought about it, he's correct. But when I'm out, I just don't like having to wait for people to use the espresso machine. So I just will get a black coffee. So today there's a big Mennonite community where I live here in Winston-Salem. Okay. And so they're not really as active or as large as they once were, but one of the kind of relics of the Mennonite presence in the town is that there's a number of really great Mennonite bakeries, and they have their sort of home generational recipes, so you can get like really great desserts and pastries and things like that. So I went over to a place called Louis and Honey's, and I just got a nice black coffee from them today. So
nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm with you on drip. I mean, Americanos are like kind of a treat for me. And usually it's like $1 or more expensive or whatever, but black coffee is just, you can't go wrong with it as long as it's good. Okay, let's move to the three. I want to hear what you think were the three best books, since we're kind of, at a turning point. We're 12 days into 2023 now. I want to hear what you thought were the three best books that you read in 2022, and why specifically you liked those books.
Well, the best book that I read last year was a novel by John Fowles called The Magus, which was published way back in 1965. And the novel is about this Oxford graduate who leaves England to teach at a English boarding school in this isolated Greek island. And it's a sort of psychological thriller, sort of along the lines of the movie from 1997. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's The Game with Michael Douglas and Sean Penn.
Okay.
And anyway, I hadn't known about Fowles until this year. Apparently, he's widely considered to be one of the best novelists of the 20th century, and so I've sort of been getting into his work recently. I really love that book. But if we're talking about philosophy or strictly phenomenological philosophy, then I think my favorite books of this year have been Walter Hopp's Introduction to Phenomenology, which came out with Routledge. Fantastic book. Walter, I think, is one of the best Husserl scholars in the world. And he studied under Dallas Willard at SC, and he gave a really, really fantastic introduction to phenomenology, which I think is worth reading. And then I also really been enjoying reading a book by Bettina Borgo called Anxiety of Philosophical History, just a massive book exploring the history of anxiety as a concept, beginning with Kant onwards. And that's a really, really good book. And then I think the third book that I really enjoyed this year was a book by Adam Graves, who wrote a book called The Phenomenology of Revelation in Heidegger, Marion, and Ricoeur. And I think that might be one of the best books that's ever been written in the theological turn to phenomenology. It's just really awesome. And I learned so much from Adam's book. So that would be another book I'd recommend.
Wow, that's high praise. Those all sound like really delightful. I'm interested in that book on anxiety. Do they deal with Kierkegaard at all in there?
Yeah, so Kierkegaard figures largely in that book, sort of as a kind of transitionary figure from German idealism into 20th century phenomenology. So Borgo discusses Kierkegaard's relationship to people like Schelling, and then explains how subsequent thinkers such as Heidegger are borrowing heavily from Kierkegaard.
Wonderful. Okay, we do have a Kierkegaard question, but I want to save that because first I want to hear a little bit about yourself for our listeners who aren't maybe familiar with you or your work. So tell me a little bit about, where you studied for your PhD, who you studied with, what kind of work you really try to kind of most prominently write in, just a little bit about yourself in terms of your academic path so far.
So I studied philosophy for my PhD. It was a two-stage process. I began my doctoral studies at Rice University under the supervision of Stephen Kroll, and it was there that I delved deeply into Husserl and Heidegger. I mean, for listeners, they're probably aware that in the world of Anglophone phenomenology, there's been a fairly dominant school that originated in Berkeley under Hubert Dreyfus, which has kind of tended to emphasize the supposed discontinuity or rupture between Husserl and Heidegger's forms of phenomenology. And so for a long time, that was kind of the prevailing way of reading the history of classical phenomenology, was to kind of accentuate Heidegger's uniqueness by sort of, relegating Husserl to a sort of merely historical status as a sort of kind of, out to lunch Cartesian. And Steve is very much against that reading. And so, one of the things that I benefited by studying with Steve was just to see how Husserl and Heidegger could kind of be read in connection to one another in a useful way. Steve isn't really a fan of the theological turn. And so when my work sort of tended in that direction, I just decided that it probably wouldn't be the best idea to try to write a thesis under the direction of someone who was very much personally against those figures. And so I ended up transferring to Oxford, where I had the opportunity to work with some people there that were going to maybe be a little bit more receptive to that work. And when I got there, I ended up bouncing around and ended up more or less working on my own, which was kind of an interesting experience. But even though my path to the DPhil was kind of unusual and in some ways fraught, it ended up working well. And so in 2017, I finished my DPhil at Oxford.
Got it. Okay. Nice. And so you've talked a little bit about already, how your work features phenomenology, especially the theological turn. But also, I mean, I've only read a little bit of your stuff. But even in your kind of like primer, your introduction to the theological turn in France, in French phenomenology, you come back to Kierkegaard many times throughout the book, especially in the conclusion or the closing chapter. So tell me a little bit about how Kierkegaard figures in your own thinking.
Kierkegaard to me is the single greatest influence or inspiration on the work I try to do. I think he's arguably the greatest philosopher of all time, and he's certainly my personal favorite. And in some ways, Kierkegaard, he changed my life. So when I was an undergraduate, I took a course in the epistemology of religious belief, and we were reading analytic philosophy of religion, works by folks like Alvin Plantinga and Warranted Christian Belief. And at the time I took that course, I was actually an atheist. And I had some friends in the class who were Christians who wanted to start an external reading group. And the first work that they suggested we read was Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And that was a really transformative experience in my life, because I had the assumption, or I suppose you could say prejudice, that Christian belief just wasn't intellectually or philosophically credible. And so I had a kind of crisis of a sort, because when I read Kierkegaard, I was struck by the fact that he was so immensely and undeniably brilliant that I had difficulty accepting that he could have been a Christian. Mm-hmm. And so my reading of Kierkegaard sort of began almost as a sort of almost like psychological investigation, trying to figure out how he could have believed the sorts of things that he believed. And then shortly after that, I had a very powerful religious experience or mystical experience that converted me to theism. And then later on, I became a Christian. And so ever since then, working my way through academic philosophy and turning to phenomenology, I've just been very interested in how it's possible to try to produce philosophical, intellectual work that is still somehow a reflection of my faith. And so Kierkegaard has always sort of been a massive inspiration for me in terms of how that might be possible.
Sure, yeah. So did you discover Kierkegaard? You said you were an atheist when you were reading Kierkegaard in kind of a reading group, but were you kind of thick in the world of philosophy before becoming Christian? Or I guess what was the sequence of events as far as because I'm interested in kind of how you discovered philosophy and theology originally, but then also like where did your conversion kind of play in that sequence of events?
I have always been a reader my entire life, ever since I was a boy. And when I was young, I was particularly interested in history and military history, and also politics. And when I got to high school, I had a really wonderful English teacher in my sophomore year that introduced us to the American transcendentalists. And so we were reading Emerson and Thoreau and figures like that. And then it was then that I was exposed to Dostoevsky and Crime and Punishment. And when I was reading those texts, which you could say aren't strictly philosophical, I was always drawn to questions that weren't necessarily coming out in the discussion in English class. And then, of course, later on when I got to college and discovered philosophy as a discipline, I figured out, those are the kinds of questions that philosophy asks. So I didn't have any exposure to philosophy in high school. And when I came to college, actually, I started out as a political science major, because Cal Poly, where I went, it's a little unusual in that they have freshmen declare majors. And so I think it was the summer between my sophomore and junior years that I had a general education class in philosophy. It was an ethics class. And we read Plato, Mill, and Nietzsche. And then it was in that fall term after summer that I took a metaphysics class. And in that class, we read Plato, Descartes, and then Gilbert Ryle. And so what happened was, when I was introduced to Gilbert Ryle and phenomenology, it sort of took me away from naturalism and materialism, because when I first came to philosophy, I was an atheist. I was a naturalist. I guess it was kind of enthralled to scientism. So phenomenology kind of showed me why naturalism is false. And so then I kind of lingered in this middle space where I was still an atheist, but I was no longer, I guess, a naturalist when it came to the philosophy of mind. And phenomenology I found to be a philosophical movement or school or way of doing philosophy that really freed me to kind of explore the issues that I was interested in. And then when I started reading Kierkegaard, I started to see how Kierkegaard's interest in faith and the nature of God was sort of suitable to phenomenological inquiries as well. And so that kind of led to an interest that I had in Heidegger.
Got it. Okay. And so you kind of worked your way like chronologically through the philosophy, like particularly through phenomenology. So you discovered Kierkegaard, then Heidegger, and then from there you moved into kind of the theological turn. Is that right?
Yeah, and so I discovered the figures that are commonly associated with the theological turn only towards sort of the later stages of my time at Rice. And I first started reading Jean-Luc Marion, and then I found Michel Henry as well, sort of became a big influence on my thinking. And then when I got to Oxford, that's where I discovered the work of Emmanuel Falque and also Jean-Yves Lacoste. So yeah, for me, it was a sort of series of discoveries, just first discovering philosophy in general, analytic philosophy, the history of philosophy, and then discovering phenomenology. And then once I discovered phenomenology, sort of being initiated into the work that's being done by the people in France who are associated with the theological turn.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder too, because like a lot of those guys are working with sort of theology proper as well. Like I know Falque works with like Balthazar a lot, and Marion works with, I know he's like really big into like the apophatic spiritual tradition. But so reading those guys, did you kind of start to discover theology, and who were kind of the theological figures that you discovered through them, if you did?
I have no formal training in theology, so the little I guess I know about theology has really just come from my own reading, and then also just discussions that I've had with people who are theology students. So when I arrived at Oxford, some of my closest friends were doctoral students in the theology faculty, and I had really no knowledge of church history or the different theological schools and movements. So I sort of just reversed engineered the history of Christian theology, starting with the philosophical figures with whom I was most familiar, like Heidegger, for example. And so I used to have discussions with my friends about Bultmann and Barth and these sorts of thinkers who were sort of in the neighborhood of Heidegger. And I had a lot of discussions about Rudolf, Otto, and people like that. But for me, I think the central theological figure that's always sort of drawn my interest above all has been Kierkegaard. But as the years have gone on, I've tried to read more widely in theology, and I have an interest in the church fathers, and I'm less interested in medieval theology, though. I try to brush up on it when I can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't blame you. A lot of it is pretty well. This scholastic stuff can be pretty dry, so I don't blame you at all for that. Um, what for? I think like a lot of people in general, but even Christians, kind of see philosophy as, I don't know, like pointless or superfluous, or like, I mean, even working from like you were talking about, kind of a naturalist perspective, and seeing philosophy as just unnecessary or as almost kind of like a ridiculous endeavor. Like I remember my freshman year of college, I was at a Bible college, and one of the gen ed requirements was this like intro to philosophy course. And I remember we were sitting in there listening to this professor lecture about like, forms or whatever in Plato. And it was just like, oh my God, that has nothing to do with my life. But so obviously I've had kind of a conversion and enjoy philosophy a lot now, and find it really, really valuable and meaningful. But what would you say is kind of what makes philosophy worth studying for Christians? Like why should Christians pay attention or try to find meaning in something like philosophy?
I think One thing to say is that not everyone has to read philosophy or theology. So, it could be the case that for some people, there's no reason to. Um, on the other hand, for people who just find themselves naturally sort of perplexed by the kinds of questions that philosophy and theology poses, then in that case, there's not necessarily a harm in doing it. Of course, there is this question about, well, what's really the value in reading philosophy or theology? And I mean, that's a question that I try to keep front in my own mind. I think that's part of the reason why I was originally drawn as I was to the philosophical traditions that I was. So I was very drawn to existentialism and very drawn to phenomenology precisely for this reason, that they're self-conscious philosophical attempts to try to make sense of the human condition and the human experience as it's lived. And that's why I'm also interested in the theological turn, because in a way it kind of merges a theological interest, this question about the question of God and man's relation to God, with a kind of existentialist approach. Of course, there's a tradition of thinkers, and here I have in mind people such as Pascal, but also, of course, Kierkegaard as well, who are always keen to emphasize the danger of diversion in human life, that human beings are capable of, in a way, failing to be themselves, whether this is through a form of conformism or something of that kind. And there are, of course, for the same tradition, intellectual forms of diversion. So if you think, for example, of Kierkegaard's criticism of what he calls Christendom, he's also very critical of theology that was being done at the time in the academic world in which he was living in Copenhagen. But of course, Kierkegaard himself is a prolific writer, and he was a certain type of philosopher or theologian in his own regard. So you have to think that unless he's just committing some kind of flagrant contradiction or is just some kind of flagrant hypocrite, that there must be a value to reading philosophy or theology, insofar as presumably he thinks that his own readers aren't wasting their time if they read his work. So I think my general rule of thumb, the way that I kind of approach the issue as a practical matter, is that, it's a question of your motivations for reading the text you're reading. So the way I see it is that if you're reading a work of theology or if you're reading a work of philosophy with the intention of having it edify you and in some way help you grow in your faith and conform to Christ, then that's a valuable exercise. If, on the other hand, you find yourself getting bogged down in these sort of abstract questions that don't really have any bearing on your existence as a human being, then you may as well just chuck those books out the window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a good word. So for people who are, for philosophers who are, very much not like religious, or maybe even, have arguments against religion or Christianity specifically, like if you're reading someone like Heidegger, who's like, he's got his whole like destruction of metaphysics and his kind of reinterpretation of like the history of Christian theology and philosophy, that can seem like antagonistic to, certain iterations of like Christian orthodoxy, whatever that means for people. So if you're reading someone like Heidegger or like Nietzsche, who kind of has a, in a similar way as like really coming at Christianity in a way, first of all, like, as a person of faith, is reading those kinds of thinkers helpful or fruitful for your faith in any way, or is it the opposite, where they're actually harmful to your faith? And kind of maybe explain why you find them helpful or harmful.
I think whether one finds reading Nietzsche or Heidegger, for example, as harmful or useful depends a lot, again, on the particular person and how they're approaching those texts and why. So, I mean, there's a tendency in the academic world of phenomenology, philosophy, but also theology to, I think, maybe in a way elevate Nietzsche and Heidegger to a sort of status that they don't deserve, right? So, I mean, when we read these sorts of texts, I think it's important to remember that we are reading books that were just written by men. That these people,
Mm-hmm.
as important as they are, as brilliant as they are, as fruitful as reading them can be, these aren't gods, right? And it's not as if God dictated being in time to Heidegger. So I think it's important, as a Christian, to not be intimidated by Nietzsche and Heidegger, and to feel as if, well, I have to avoid reading these texts because somehow my faith can't hold up under the things that Nietzsche and Heidegger have to say. So I think that if one's faith is strong enough and one is thoughtful enough, reading Heidegger and Nietzsche can actually be a useful exercise, because it's liberating, I've found, to discover that one's faith can survive a confrontation with the great philosophers. I mean, from a perspective of just intellectual honesty, if you're doing academic work, then I think it's important to start with Nietzsche and Heidegger and have something intelligible to say in response, because it's just dishonest to pretend that what Nietzsche and Heidegger have had to say about Christian faith hasn't been said. But at the same time, I think there's also a tendency to dwell too long on Nietzsche and Heidegger and to make everything that's done in Christian theology, at least within the phenomenological world, maybe too responsive to Nietzsche and Heidegger. So, my view is that one should have a clear understanding in his own mind of what a Christian should say in response to Nietzsche and Heidegger. And then once one has clarified that, then you can move on and go on to say what it is that you want to say. But that's a process. I mean, for me, there have been a number of thinkers who have done this in their own work that's been hugely inspiring to me. So you can mention someone like Emmanuel Falque, who's has had a lot to say about Heidegger over this question of finitude and how Christian faith is responsive to the criticisms that Heidegger made about faith. And Jean-Yves Lacoste has also done so. And, of course, Jean-Luc Marion has had a lot to say, not only about Heidegger, but also Nietzsche. I mean, when I was at Oxford, and this was 2015, Brian Leiter from the University of Chicago came to the post-Kantian philosophy seminar there at Oxford, and he gave a paper on Nietzsche, which was titled, I think, The Death of God and the Death of Morality. And there, Leiter was kind of giving the standard Nietzschean line that modernity is characterized by this death of God, where the death of God means that we've sort of discovered, supposedly, that God doesn't exist. And of course, one of the implications of this reputed discovery is that it undermines what we've previously taken to be the grounding for our moral systems. And so during the question and answer period, I asked Leiter about what he makes of Jean-Luc Marion's response to this. So in works like Negative Certainties and other places, Marion has basically criticized the Nietzschean conception of the death of God as itself being an instance in what Marion calls metaphysics, where metaphysics amounts, when it comes to the question of God, to a form of what Marion calls conceptual idolatry. So basically, to go back to this point about the Afropanic approach to theology, or the negative theology, as you said before, Marion's basic idea is that when Nietzsche takes himself to be criticizing belief in God, Marion claims that the sort of God that Nietzsche has in mind is precisely that. It's an idea. It's a God of our minds, of our own construction. But Marion wants to make the point that it doesn't at all follow from the fact that God is no longer credible, that the true Christian God doesn't exist. And I think that's an important lesson to learn. Of course, Nietzscheans are resistant to that claim, but I do think that there's a fundamental power to the critique that someone like Marion has made against Nietzsche.
Yeah, for sure. No, yeah. And I think Heidegger makes kind of a similar mistake in his interpretation of sort of the history of Christian theology. Like I think he seems to like pass over the whole apophatic tradition, like in his destruction of metaphysics and kind of a scholastic mode of metaphysics. Like he is almost, and from what I'm aware of, like I think he was aware of negative theology and this, kind of stream within the Christian tradition that was long-standing, but he seems to totally pass over it or ignore it in his criticism. So it's interesting that he doesn't address it at all.
Just a quick word there about Heidegger.
Yeah.
In the early 20s, of course, Heidegger gave a series of lectures on the phenomenology of religious life, and there he's talking mainly about some letters from Paul, but he does mention mysticism as a problem. And I think one of the reasons why Heidegger was interested in the problem or question of mysticism is it touches on a number of themes that get worked out more thematically in works of his, such as Being and Time, and then particularly in his later thinking, which is this issue about ineffability, right? And so actually, I mean, a lot of the things that Heidegger has to say about being, which is for him not an entity, no being, are very similar to what negative theology more traditionally had ascribed to God. And so there's something interesting going on in Heidegger's critique of onto-theology, his critique of Christian theology, where he sort of elevates being almost to the status of what God previously had occupied. And I think that, again, that's one of the useful things about Jean-Luc Marion's critique of Heidegger. So if you think of one of his, I think his very first book, which was The Idol in the Distance, Marion discusses Nietzsche in there. And then, of course, there's the famous book as well, God Without Being. And so, yeah, the idea is that there are phenomenological resources that can allow the Christian theologian, or indeed just the Christian phenomenologist, to hopefully say something intelligible and useful and truthful about the nature of God and the nature of faith in a way that sort of circumvents some of these criticisms that Heidegger and Nietzsche have made.
Yeah, and I like what you said a little bit earlier about kind of it being possible to like overlinger a bit on these great philosophers like Nietzsche and Heidegger. Like, I can't tell you how many really great books I've read that were basically 2/3 of like grappling with Heidegger and Nietzsche, or I don't know, whatever else. And then only in like the last third or the last chapter do they really start to like offer a corrective or like a constructive proposal of their own. So I do, yeah, I like the nuance that you're kind of proposing here of like, definitely being willing to engage and sort of meet these great philosophers where they're at, but not to like make your whole theological project just solely a response to them, and not making it so much about so much about kind of grappling with their work. So I appreciate that a lot. One of the kind of moving on now, one of the things you talk about, I think it's in your introduction to the Phenomenology in France book. You talk about how there's kind of this conception that like the French theological turn in phenomenology is kind of dominated by Catholics, or that it's only written for, to and for Catholics. And you kind of say, no, that's not true. Like you don't have to be a Catholic to benefit from this work. But why do you think that this theological turn has been so dominated by Catholic philosophers, and why does it seem like there are so few Protestants kind of engaging in this?
That to me is a mystery. I'm not sure if I have a completely worked out explanation for why that is the case, though as you remark, it certainly is the case. So it's curious. To go back just for a moment to the point about Nietzsche's critique of God or belief in God, when I had mentioned Marion's response to Nietzsche at the Leiter seminar, Leiter didn't respond to Marion's criticism. He just said, "Oh well, I'm not interested in Catholic apologetics." And so I thought that this is really suggestive, because Leiter's basic attitude was that, well, I don't have to read Marion because all Marion is doing is just Catholic apologetics. And so when I wrote Phenomenology in France, I wanted to try to do something to the extent that I can to kind of disabuse people of that idea, because I don't think that someone like Marion, for example, is doing just Catholic apologetics. It is true that Marion has written works that are self-consciously, strictly apologetical. So I have in mind a more recent book of his called A Brief Apology for a Catholic Moment. But if you look at his earlier phenomenological works like Reduction and Givenness or Being Given, it's certainly true that from a philosophical perspective, he's doing conceptual legwork that later on will open to theological horizons. But Marion himself maintains that he's still doing philosophy and not theology. And as someone who's not a Catholic, I don't find that when I read those works of Marion, that the phenomena that he's attempting to describe are somehow ideologically tainted by his own Catholicism. Mm-hmm. Now, there's the question, as you ask, why is it that so many of the great contemporary phenomenologists in France are Catholic? I mean, Falque's Catholic, Marion's Catholic, Lacoste himself is a priest. Michel Henry converted to Catholicism toward the end of his life. It could just be sociologically that in France, Catholicism is just the predominant Christian denomination. So those who are inclined to become Christian just end up converting to Catholicism. Of course, there's also the point that Husserl himself was a Protestant. And of course, Heidegger converted to Protestantism after having been a Catholic. And then, of course, you can't forget someone like Paul Ricoeur, who was a Protestant. So there are important thinkers in the history of phenomenology who weren't Catholic. Not all of the great thinkers have been Catholics. It is true that at this point, a lot of the work in the theological turn is confined to Catholic universities like Boston College. So I don't know. I think part of it may have something to do with the inheritance of Thomism, and then also disagreements about the nature of natural theology. So this is a little speculative on my point, but beyond just mere sociological forces, I think part of what could be going on is that there are some people who are hostile to God in general, people who are atheists who are working in phenomenology or in analytic philosophy who aren't interested in the theological turn at all for that reason, that they think that it's just veiled Christian apologetics. So that's one camp of people. Then you have people who are Catholic who don't like phenomenology. And typically these people tend to be Thomists. And I think it's because on their view, right, phenomenology is sort of just tainted by modernity. So from their perspective, the history of philosophy after medieval scholasticism, everything has just been a fall, right? And so they want to just go back to someone like Aquinas and stay there. And so they're not interested in phenomenology at all, even if some of its most prominent current practitioners happen to be Catholic. And then from the perspective of certain Protestant theologians, I think there again, there could be some sort of hostility toward phenomenology, because phenomenology sometimes has been sort of associated with phenomenalism or subjectivism. And so they think that there's a kind of absence of realism in the phenomenological movement as it was sort of formulated by someone like Husserl. And then when it comes to the question of revelation or theology, I think people working out of a Reform tradition, people who are influenced deeply by thinkers like Barth, for example, they think that in a way phenomenology is operating noetically in the dark. So they think that if phenomenology is a philosophical movement, then that means it's not theology, which means that it's not operating within the bounds of grace, which means that it can't really get to the truth. So from the Protestant perspective, the idea would be there's this sort of dilemma, which is that, well, if people like Marion and others who insist that phenomenology is philosophical and not merely theological, well, then it can't really have anything ultimately important to say about the nature of reality, because it's operating basically with man's fallen noetic faculties. On the other hand, if it is theology, then it's not really philosophy. And so it's not important for that reason either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like that kind of clean distinction between nature and grace makes, in some ways, maybe makes phenomenology like untenable, which is where I think someone like Falque is so helpful in kind of exploring like the borderlands sort of between philosophy and theology, which I think is just so important. But do you feel like there's anything maybe Protestant theologians, Protestant philosophers are missing in kind of sweeping phenomenology under the rug, or something that could be kind of gained or benefited from listening to phenomenology?
Yeah, one thing would be the Protestant emphasis on the text is, of course, important. And some of the greatest phenomenological figures, and here I would include someone like Kierkegaard, have been very adamant that there's a proper way from a spiritual perspective to read Scripture, right? The idea is that Scripture is supposed to be the mirror of the Word. It's the word by which we confront ourselves, right? And what I would suggest is that one thing that phenomenology is capable of doing when it's done well is that it can explicate the fundamental existential structures that the scriptures themselves are referring to. So for this reason, I would talk about what you might call a phenomenology of faith, or a phenomenology of being in the Spirit. The idea that when one has become a Christian and is living a Christian life, there's room to philosophically or phenomenologically reflect upon the structure of that experience, and that in doing so, one in turn will be explicating structures that are discussed and outlined within the body of Scripture itself.
Yeah, that's great. I haven't read your phenomenology of faith book. Is that one called In the Spirit? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read that one yet, but I definitely have it on my bookshelf, and I'm really excited to read it. Okay, so we've talked a lot about phenomenology. Obviously, there are a whole wealth of phenomenologists, historically speaking. So out of all the whole cadre of phenomenologists, whether the classical guys, the German, French, theological turn, out of all of them, who would you say is kind of the GOAT, like the greatest of all time? Or I guess maybe another way to put it would be like who has put forth like its most brilliant iteration in your estimation?
Well, I suppose one would have to say it's Husserl, if only because he's the founder, and without him, there wouldn't be phenomenology. And I think that as time goes on, and it becomes clear that Husserl, in a way, is inexhaustible, and that there's always more to learn from him, and that he was really on to a number of things which, at various stages in the history of phenomenology, critics of his thought that he wasn't aware of, and it turns out that he was. But the greatest iteration of phenomenology, in my view, would have to have been provided by Michel Henry, who I think at some point might ultimately be considered to have been the greatest phenomenologist of the 20th century.
And it's okay. That's definitely not who I was expecting you to say. I mean, obviously, Michel Henry is phenomenal, no pun intended. But I guess I was imagining you saying like Heidegger, or knowing you like Marion, or something like that. But why Henri? What makes you say Henri?
Well, I don't mention Marion simply because I wanted to confine my answer to those who are not still active and alive and working today.
Okay, I see. Okay.
So Henri died, I think, in 2001. Heidegger, of course, is very important, but I do think that one of the things that Henri has shown is that the Heideggerian philosophy, despite all of its virtues in many respects, ultimately leads you to a position that it leads to a position for which it becomes impossible to account for what, in Henri's view, makes the human being a human being, which is his standing before God. And so I do think that there's something very perceptive in Henri's critique of Heidegger's account of Dasein and being in the world, that it somehow short circuits what it means to be a human by just focusing in existence in terms of what Heidegger calls the structure of worldhood.
Sure. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, obviously we've spoken a lot in praise of phenomenology, but if you had to kind of play devil's advocate and poke and prod at the weaknesses of the school of thought, like what specific critiques would you make of it?
I think one of the strongest critiques of phenomenology, or certainly one of the most prevalent, is a line of criticism that originates from thinkers that are associated with the hermeneutic tradition. And so the idea, and again, this is an objection that one will frequently come across when people are engaging with Marion's work. So if you think of someone like Wilfrid Sellers' The Myth of the Given, right? A lot of people have said that phenomenology is fundamentally misconceived methodologically because the view of experience that it presupposes or helps itself to ignores the role of interpretation and conceptuality and history and all these other sort of forces that are at work in shaping the kind of experience that we take ourselves to enjoy when we reflect on it first personally. And so the idea is that phenomenology is somehow naive because when it reflects first personally on the structures that it takes to be constitutive and necessary of experience, it's somehow blind to the kind of presuppositions that are actually at work, not only in that methodological practice, but that are at work in the nature of experience itself, that's shaping that experience. So people have said that, well, Marion, his account of the saturated phenomenon, it doesn't account for the role of interpretation and how people interpret what's given to them. And so phenomenology is sort of dead in the water. And I think that criticism has a kind of superficial compellingness to it, but the phenomenological rejoinder to that kind of hermeneutic objection, and really to all the kinds of objections you might find, whether it's objections from analytic philosophy of mind and consciousness studies, where people like the Churchlands or Dan Dennett will say that consciousness in some sense doesn't exist, or that it's impossible to inquire into the nature of consciousness from a first person point of view. These sorts of criticisms is that any of those kinds of claims, any kind of account along those lines is ultimately going to have to be made in virtue of what that position itself takes to be given, or takes to be manifest, or takes itself to have somehow intuited. Yeah. So the kind of Husserlian response is to say that anytime somebody wants to criticize phenomenology as a philosophical school by claiming that it's blind to something, the question is, well, how does the person making that claim know so? And then the point becomes that methodologically speaking, the only way to properly adjudicate that dispute is in terms of a first person intuition, or a kind of seeing that's constitutive of phenomenological practice itself anyway.
Yeah, I love that answer. Thank you for that. Okay, moving to our desert island question, which is in some ways similar to who you think is the greatest of all time, but it's distinct in that we're talking more about like who would you yourself actually enjoy reading the most. So if you were stranded on a desert island for we'll say roughly like 3 years, and you could only have the collection of all of the writings of one phenomenologist and only one phenomenologist. They can be living or dead, but if you could only have the collection of one of them with you on the island, whose corpus would you choose and why?
I would choose the works of Jean-Louis Chrétien. So I said that Michel Henry, in a way, provides the most brilliant iteration of phenomenological philosophy. And I think that's true in that Henri developed a very systematic body of works articulating a sort of unified vision of the nature of the human being and how philosophical reflection should get at the nature of that human experience. But from a spiritual perspective, or from an edifying perspective, ultimately I find Chrétien to be head and shoulders above all the other phenomenologists. And he also happened to be the most prolific. So he wrote, I think, like something around 30 books in his lifetime. So if I were stuck on a desert island, he'd also give me the most to read. So I'd have to take Jean-Louis' books with me.
Oh, okay. 30. How many of those have been translated in English? I feel like he doesn't have that many translated. I mean, definitely not 30, but not even 10, right? Published in English?
Yeah, a small fraction. Roughly 6 or 7 of his books have been translated.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, well, I'll be excited to see them in translation. And as I learn French, I'll definitely pick up some of those other ones. Let's talk a bit about the relationship between philosophy and fiction, because obviously you've published a good bit, a very good amount of philosophy for having just finished your PhD a few years ago. But what's maybe lesser known is that you've more recently kind of also turned to fiction, which has been kind of something of a phenomenon. Again, no pun intended. Among phenomenologists, historically speaking. So, could you tell us a little bit about why this kind of relationship between philosophy and fiction and what it means to you, since you're also writing your own fiction?
Yeah. So, one thing to say is that there are those who have long observed that even in Husserl's view of phenomenological methodology, there seems to be a potential connection between writing philosophy or doing philosophy and writing literature, or what's at stake in literature. And the reason this is said is that in Husserl's philosophical methodology, he talks about what he calls eidetic variation. And basically the idea is that the phenomenologist is looking for the essence of a structure or of a phenomenon. It's not supposed to just be based on empirical generalization or limited to a particular case. The idea is that you're looking for a kind of universality that's instantiated in the particularity. And so to get at that essence or that universality or that necessity, Husserl proposes what he calls eidetic variation, the idea that one imagines in one's mind all the ways in which something could lose certain attributes until it no longer is the thing that it is. And he says that this is done in a mode as if, right? So that it involves a kind of imaginative variation. Another way to think about it is that Husserl is interested in what you could call ideality, the sort of essence of a thing. And I think this is what's going on in good literature or good philosophical literature. And I think that this goes some way toward explaining why some of the phenomenologists were also novelists. Of course, there's Sartre, there's Camus, and also Michel Henry wrote a number of novels. I mean, recently I came across a really fascinating interview that Matthew Clemente did with Richard Kearney in the LA Review of Books. And the discussion there was about the nature between fiction and philosophy. And Richard made the point that you have what you might call artistic philosophers, so people like Camus or Nietzsche. And then on the other hand, you have what you might call philosophical artists, people like Dostoevsky. And one way to try to draw a distinction between literature and philosophy is to say that philosophy is in the business of making a truth claim. And it's in the business of saying how things are and how we should behave and what we should believe. And you might further think that insofar as that's what uniquely characterizes philosophical inquiry as a sort of pursuit of truth, as in the business of making truth claims, then it means that the one who makes these claims is responsible for them. So when one authors a philosophical text, it's always fair to ask the author in question, well, is this what you believe? And why do you think it's true? Whereas in the case of literature, you might think, well, it doesn't make similar sense to, for example, read Dostoevsky and say, well, is this what you believe? Because Dostoevsky might say, well, no, that's not what I believe. That's what the character says. And so the idea is that literature isn't in the business of making the kinds of truth claims on behalf of an author in the way that a work of philosophy is. I mean, the classic kind of discussion for this issue is Roland Barthes's famous 1967 essay, The Death of the Author. And there, Barthes makes sort of three key interrelated claims. He first makes this claim about the nature of the voice in literature. And he says that the kind of meaning that's at stake in a literary text, or the kind of meaning that a literary text exhibits, is unique as a piece of writing, because he says in the case of literature, the voice is special in that he says it's neuter, or that it's a confluence of voices. You can't identify the voice of the text with the author or even with the narrator. It has a sort of impersonality that is built into the nature of the text. And so then second of all, he says, well, the meaning of the text, the ultimate meaning of the text, well, there is no such thing. There's no secret meaning of the text that we have to decipher. He says that the author, the literary author, he says is a scripter. He's inscribing something. He's not expressing something. So the death of the author for Barth means that the author doesn't precede his text. The meaning of the text is strictly in the text itself, the language of the text. And then the third point he makes is that if that's all the case, if the voice that uniquely characterizes literature is that it can't be traced back to any one specific identifiable source, and if that means that the meaning of the text is liberated in such a way that now language itself is the locus of meaning, then it means that the reader takes priority. So he says that the destination of the meaning is no longer in its origin, but it resides with the reader. So that's a kind of fundamental challenge to literary meaning that, again, might help one distinguish the distinction, if there is one, between literature and philosophy. You could say, well, when a philosopher writes a work, it's in his own voice. We know who's writing it, and he's in some sense responsible and answerable for what he's written. Whereas in a work of literature, that's just not the case.
Yeah. Wow. That's so interesting. Yeah. Very good. I'm excited to read. I want to read that Richard Kearney interview. That sounds really, really good.
Well, just a quick follow on to that point, though, is that's a view, but I'm still inclined to think that even though in the kind of postmodern condition in which we live, that kind of distinction between philosophy and theology sounds plausible. I think that there are ways that authors who are writing literature can still have a kind of control over the meaning of their text that makes literature a means of doing philosophy, but it requires certain techniques that are difficult, but they can be done. And so one of the things I'll just mention briefly has to do with the voice of the narrator. So, in a lot of literary texts, the narrator is a character in the text. He's someone or she's someone who is party to the events in the story. That's one approach. Another approach is to kind of have an omniscient narrator who somehow has access to everybody's thoughts, including the protagonist. What I've tried to do in the novels I've written is create what I kind of call a third person interiority. So there is, I guess, what you could call a narrator insofar as someone is telling the story, but the narrator isn't really, strictly speaking, a character in the story because the narrator isn't the protagonist. But at the same time, neither is it the case that the narrator lacks access to the protagonist's mind. So there's a kind of limited omniscience. So people like Jean-Louis Chrétien and Barth and others have said, well, one of the problems with modern literature is that it abandons realism because very often the narrator has a kind of omniscience that no human person really has. So what I've tried to do in my novels is have a kind of third person interiority whereby the person telling the story is not the protagonist, and yet he has access uniquely to the protagonist's mind and beliefs, but he doesn't have access to the thoughts and beliefs of others. So it's a sort of compromised position where it's no longer clear who the voice is because it sounds in a way as if it's coming from the protagonist, and yet the voice isn't identifiable with the protagonist, and yet at the same time, the voice isn't omniscient. And so this is to say that the voice in a way is ambiguous in the way that Barth says the literary voice is. But I would also say as the author that I am in control of that voice. I created that voice specifically in the way that I did for ultimately philosophical reasons. So I do think that there's a meaning to the text that I as the author have given the text, even if it's true to say, as Barth notes, that there's no longer a kind of omniscience that's at work in the text.
Sure. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Thank you for sharing. Okay, let's wrap up with our last question, which is just what's next for you? What do you kind of have in the works right now?
Well, let's see. Right now, I guess I remember you had mentioned, or you asked, well, what were the three best books I read this year? There's a fourth book I could have mentioned, which is a book by Anthony Rudd that's on art. It's called Why Paintings Matter, and I'm writing a book review of that book right now. And then in the summer, I'm going to be giving a paper on Marion and metaphysics at a conference in Buenos Aires. So I'm working on a paper on Marion right now. And there's also the volume that hopefully will be coming out soon with Wipf and Stock, the Finding Meaning volume. And so I'm working on the introduction to that volume. I'm toying with a few books right now. I have a book that I want to write on film noir. And then there's a book that I want to write on the phenomenon of conscience, which in a way is going to be similar to the sort of book that Bettina Borgo wrote about the history of anxiety. And then there's a third book that I'm thinking about that is going to explore the theological history of the concept of original sin. And then the final thing that I'm working on is a translation of one of Jean-Luc Chrétien's books, which I hope to have translated for next year.
Lovely. That all sounds like great stuff. I'll be anxious to read some of it. So I just want to say thank you, Stephen, for taking the time. It's been a really fun, enjoyable conversation. So appreciate you taking some time out of your day to talk.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it.